Well, hello. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about your essay, I. And actually, before I go on, is that how you would pronounce the title?
That's right. Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I read the note about how to pronounce it because, as we'll discuss a little bit later, you have this really interesting um, grammar and punctuation that gets used throughout with this dividing line. And so it was really so much fun for me as a reader to interact with that and to think about it. But before we get to all of that, I'd love to ask a question which I am so curious about because in addition to this essay, which is in very much, it's talking about reflections and mirrors and the self, you also have a chapbook called Facing the Mirror. And I wanted to know what started your fascination with mirrors?
Sure. Yeah. So Facing the Mirror it appears in II. So I wrote the chapbook first and then wrote the full length. So they're not two completely separate pieces. There's a lot of overlap. But I realized that I was just a lot of my poems when I was in graduate school and trying to write things for workshop for my peers to read and enjoy, that in a lot of poems, mirrors were just appearing because they make very good symbols. They have a lot of they have a long history of being a symbol in religion and then also, as I came to find out, like a lot of uses in psychology as well. But so they appeared a lot, and I realized, I was like, this is really interesting. I should think more about this and why. And it occurred to me, and it's funny that this didn't happen initially, but it occurred to me as I was thinking about mirrors that part of my fascination with them was that they actually trigger my skin picking symptoms. So I have dermatillomania, also known as skin picking disorder. It's called a few different things. And for a lot of people who have skin picking disorder or a lot of different neurodiverse manifestations, that mirrors can be really challenging and difficult for us. And so for me in particular, that means that I sometimes pick my skin when I'm not looking at a mirror, but I'm much more likely to if there's a mirror there. Yeah, so I realized as I was simultaneously doing research about like how are mirrors invented and when did people start using them and how did people think about them, because they seem sort of witchcrafty, which they did initially for a very long time in the West. And yeah, so as I was simultaneously doing that work, I was also thinking about my own relationship with the mirror. And I couldn't escape this question of like, well, if mirrors didn't exist, would I even be neurodiverse? Like, would I even have this identity? And how strange is that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And the other thing that came up for me is, do you have a memory or early memories of your first interactions with a mirror? Because I think for me, the thing that really struck me as I was reading this is it really brought me back to my really early ideas of mirrors and how, as a kid, I was fascinated by them. Like, to the point where my mom would make fun of me when I was a small child because she's like, who are you staring at? And then she would look behind her and it was like the glass of some building that was reflected. And I think there's something really innocent in some ways and also really
Yeah.
primal about our interest in ourselves and our reflection. And so yeah, I'm just curious about that in your own life.
Yeah, I'm sure there are things earlier than this that I can remember, but an early memory does appear in the early pages of the book, which is I remember the bathroom that I shared with my siblings um, had this what seemed like an enormous mirror when I was little. And it started at the countertop and just went higher than I was tall, and was the whole length of the room. So like the whole length of the countertop. And I remember, um, switching the light off and watching my pupils get big in the dark. And I was like, what? And they switched the light back on and then they shrank. And I remember just doing that. And like the fact that I could see it and like know it was going to happen before it happened and watch it happen and like watch the light turn off and then it would happen. That like the time of that was really interesting to me. But I'm sure, yeah, I mean, it's like you said, there's something really innocent about like a little kid just like flicking the light on and off and like looking at their own eyes. But yeah, I mean, we also, in my household growing up, I'm one of 6 kids, and there was somebody in the house, we don't know who it was, some kid in the house kissed the mirror a bunch. There were like kiss marks all over the mirror. And we have, every couple years we change our idea of who we think it was and make fun of them. And but it's like that too. There's somebody at a very young age thought it was so interesting that they were kissing their own reflection just all over the mirror.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that brings up for me in that memory in different parts of the book is you have these sections where you kind of introduce them as a practice, where there's almost instructions about how to interact with your reflection. The one I really love is the one where you take a pad of sticky notes and a pen and you go into the kitchen and you write down every object where you see yourself reflected. And you have this really great line where you say like how many yous you live with, or how many you live with. And I really, that really resonated with me. And I'm just wondering how you see the essay functioning, not just as the static thing on a page, but something really participatory. And if that's something you thought about for this essay in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. The practices are some of my favorite pieces of the book as well. And I think I just had this, I mean, part of it was that I had an obsession with C.A. Conrad's Soma Poetics and like eco-deviance, where there are a lot of like rituals and instructions and things that you're supposed to be doing outside, like off the page, outside the realm of the text, that you're supposed to be doing with your body. And there's a lot of really interesting research coming out about the importance of ritual. And so I was thinking about those things, and then also thinking about how, mirrors have played very central roles in a lot of rituals since their invention, kind of across many different cultures and traditions. And I didn't want the book to be limited to a philosophical exercise. Like I didn't want it to be me looking at myself and talking about it, which there's definitely a lot of that. But I had this desire to widen the space of the book and talk about, sight generally and light generally, and about how the very small space between us and a mirror, it really has a lot of effects on how we live our life outside of our house, outside of seeing yourself across the street in a building, in the windows reflections. And yeah, so I wanted to, and also because of the very like physical nature of skin picking in particular, I wanted the body to be present in the healing endeavor the book takes on. And I wanted to offer that as an option to the reader. And I think there are places in the book where you can certainly physically do those things. Like you can take a sticky pad and or a pad of sticky notes and a pen and do that exercise if you want. But you can also just read about it and think about that. And maybe the next time you're in your kitchen, you're like, oh yeah, my microwave is very reflective or whatever. So yeah, I think I just had this desire to make the book very physically present as well.
Yeah, and I really felt that, especially there's a line you write towards the end of the essay where you say a practice, one way to intentionally conduct my body toward hope. And I love this idea that practice and ritual can be a way of maybe not necessarily even being hopeful, but conducting yourself in a way that allows for hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I feel like it's interesting because, and you also mentioned how culturally mirrors have existed across time. You have allusions to Greek myths, the Bible, Jewish mourning customs, Lorca, like really it spans the gamut. But a lot of those, at least in my view as I was reading, a lot of those illusions show mirrors in kind of a negative way. In some way,
Right.
have a sense of entrapment, or like with Narcissus, there's like this really tragic element to it.
Mhm.
And I'm curious for you, do you find that the experience of uh, these rituals around mirrors, or rituals in general, to be one that's hopeful, or one that's maybe more entrapping, a bit of both?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bit of both. One piece that I think of immediately when you ask that question is um, sort of mirrors' role in photography, and how essentially, like, when photography was invented, mirrors were central to that process. Like, you could not have taken a photograph without mirrors. And but before even photography was invented, there was this idea in some places, and particularly I'm thinking about early Christian pilgrims who would take these little hand mirrors with them and hold them up to things like a camera, because they believed that if the mirror saw something, that it was there in the mirror. So they were like essentially taking photos they could never see, but like that mirror, when they took it home with them, was like the place where all those things were saved. And So I think it's both. I think anything that has a lot of mystery to it, and um a lot of curiosity in terms of like, how does this work? Why is this doing this to my psychology? To, like, why do we use mirrors to test the psychology of different animals and the developmental stages of babies and all these things? Like, I think anything that has that much mystery and power to it has the ability to be used in, as you said, like negative ways, or in very like deeply meaningful healing ways. I know also inside Mormon temples, there's usually a mirror at the altar that they use in marriage ceremonies. So when people are married, they're supposed to, and I don't know exactly how this works, but because I'm not Mormon and I haven't been in a temple, but from what I've heard and read, mirrors are part of the marriage ceremony because they signify eternity. So you're looking into the mirror image of your soon-to-be spouse, and that's like part of that ritual. So there's just, I think, a lot of symbolism and mystery, and that those things lend themselves to power on either side of morality, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a rich symbol.
Yeah.
And I think, well, and speaking of symbols, the symbol I'm really interested in that I would love for you to explain more about, is the one that's in the title of the book, and that
Yeah.
gets used throughout the book, which is this dividing line. I know there's a lot of different like terms for this symbol, even
Hmm.
like there's not even the same word for it across different disciplines and things like that. And you
Hmm.
do have a note in the book about why you decided to use it and the different practices that use it. But I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about that and how you came to use this symbol.
Sure. Thanks for asking about it. I think it's the most obvious usage is that it looks like the mirror. So it looks like the line across which the I in the title is reflected. Um, and that's how I initially started using it when I was drafting what would eventually become II. Was just thinking about a way to multiply selves, because there's a method in the book in which I call it the vertical slash, for the most part when I'm thinking about it. There's a method in the book in which the vertical slash appears to duplicate or reflect personal pronouns. So I, my, me. And so in that way, it's very clearly, the surface of the mirror. Um, But like you said, there's a note in the book that gives a few other readings as well. And probably my favorite one is the Sheffer stroke, which is the way the vertical slash is used in logic. And basically it's a symbol that stands for NAND, or not and, which means that, so on either side of the vertical slash, you have like one object and then another. And you can have both be false, you can have one be true, but you cannot have both be simultaneously true. And that is the Sheffer stroke. So I found that to be a really fruitful way to think about. I mean, like, punctuation is so fascinating. And that much meaning can be embedded in just a symbol like that is really fascinating to me. But yeah, in terms of that personal pronoun, there's this idea that, like, well, I'm my true self and the reflection is false, right? But is there sometimes ways in which what we see in the mirror, or what we interpret seeing in the mirror, is truer than ourselves? And so yeah, that's how the vertical slash is used throughout the book.
Yeah, I love that. And the Sheffer stroke is so interesting. Like,
Mhm.
I think that kind of logic about when things are able to be true and how their truth is in direct relation to the other thing,
Yeah.
is so interesting. And I think it's also really true about how we think about ourselves. And I think for me, the other thing that came up in this book is, I think right now we're very much in a culture that is talking a lot about the ways we're being perceived and the
Mhm.
ways that we want to be perceived, especially in social media, and talking about things like self-love and self-acceptance, and really being like, we just want to accept ourselves exactly as we are. But at the same time, I think we also have this opposite impulse where sometimes
Yes.
we want to just not be perceived at all and really unmake that self. And I love this line in the essay. At one point you say, I want sobriety from my body to be clean of my body's compulsions. And then you write, I hone my own hurt. And I think it's interesting. And then there's this really cool allusion to Medusa and her snakes in her own body literally destroying itself. And I'm just curious, while you were writing this, did you feel in any way that you were writing something that was going counter to a lot of those trends in the culture right now? Or did you feel like you were writing something that was really kind of falling in line with them?
That's interesting. I think when you write, when you are in the middle of writing something, it's really hard to think about, like, how does this fit into cultural, like, trends and the zeitgeist and all that. But I do think, as you were asking the question, I thought a lot about how that, like, movement towards, like, body acceptance and self-love and, like, hashtag no filter is really in direct response to, or happening simultaneous to, all the filters, and social media is a highlight reel, and people are only presenting their best selves, and fake it till you make it, and, like, all of those things are happening at the same time. And I think at a certain point it's hard to extrapolate, like, chicken or egg, um but yeah, I when I was, and this may be kind of a sideways way to answer your question, so tell me if if it's a little too sideways. But one of the things I was thinking about in writing this book was healing, and what that looks like, and how possible that is, both in a text and in um in a text that's about me, but also fully recognizing that um I'm not going to, like, write a book and then all of a sudden never pick my skin again. That would be wonderful, but then and it's, I think, also in the same way that we have this culture that is obsessed with appearance and also rejects that obsession, it is it's writing about myself and trying to reach other people. I mean, it's all these ways to like create healing out of a hurt place and create healing with the very, like, I want to say inaccurate or imperfect tools that I have available to me. Language, which is saturated in the culture we're in, books, the very static page, all of these things. So I don't know if that's really answering your question, but those are just some of the things that I was thinking about, that also, I guess, speak to a cultural moment, even though I wasn't necessarily saying like, oh yeah, I want to talk about that thing that's happening.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is it wasn't really pointing to specific moments in the culture right now, but it very much to me as a reader felt like it was reflecting things that I was seeing. And to be thinking about the ways that we perceive ourselves to ourselves and the
Right.
ways that like seeing doesn't even do justice to the entirety of what we are and what we experience.
Right.
Yeah, and I think there's also like the other thing you brought up that I really appreciated is how we are a culture that is simultaneously obsessed with appearance and really rejecting the idea that we could be obsessed with appearance or
Right.
embarrassed by it in some way.
Yes, so embarrassed. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like there's one other part in the essay where you're talking about how sometimes you'll go into the bathroom, stare at the mirror, but turn on the faucet so that it doesn't appear as though you are just staring at yourself in the mirror.
Right.
And you
Like, I'm
write,
doing stuff. I'm doing stuff in here.
yeah, exactly. Like it's really important. Like, I'm taking a bath. Like,
Right.
and there's a line where you say, how many baths anyone could have taken in those years of water, how clean all could be. And I'm curious from you, why do you think that we are embarrassed about feeling the need to assess our appearance or to even perceive ourselves?
Yeah, and the embarrassment question is so good and important because I think also a lot of the work of writing this book for me was like against shame and uncovering shame. But I think of a couple different things very immediately when you ask that question. And one is this idea that that came up in a few different places when I was doing research for this book, that like, well, we weren't designed to ever know what we look like. Like, in a state of nature, people tell us we're attractive or that your eyes are this color. You can see your own hair, but you don't have a sense of like what your own face looks like. Maybe you could look at your parents' faces and come up with some idea. Or somebody could draw for you what your face looked like. But that's why we have so many portraits from a certain era. But I think that's one thing, is this idea that like, well, of course we're obsessed with what we look like because for a long time that was completely impossible. And this is still, like, evolutionarily speaking, relatively new technology for us to just pull out our phone and take a selfie, or take 80 selfies and pick the best one and post it. Speaking from experience. And the other thing I think about is, in America in particular, there's I think a lot of our cultural sense of morality still comes from Puritanism and Christian Calvinism, and those traditions really reject anything having to do with the body, other than maybe like suffering as a way to experience the divine. So they really reject like being comfortable in the body, even, or like physical attraction or attractiveness, and yet that's in direct conflict with our consumerist culture and and the ways things are sold to us, I'm like the 30 millionth person to say this, but how things are sold to us because we feel bad about ourselves, right? Like, oh, your skin is wrinkly, here's a cream. Oh, your hair is gray, here's dye to fix that, and you're like, well, I didn't feel bad about my gray hair until just now. Should I? So yeah, I think there's just all those different, very massive forces at play. And those manifest themselves, as I think we saw particularly during the pandemic, in a lot of pressure on people, and that pressure has to go somewhere. And I think for some people that's like what's termed neurodivergence, and for some people that's a very specific kind of rejection of the model of how we're supposed to live in this country. But yeah, I think it comes from a lot of different places, but it's not new. I think it's very old.
Absolutely. And I think something else you said really stuck with me is the idea that, there's all these products and solutions being marketed to us as though like there has to be a solution to all of these problems with us.
Right.
And you were talking earlier about how you knew that writing this book was a healing process, but it didn't mean that you were never going to pick your skin again, or that you were never going to have an issue with perception again. And if this book is not a solution, then for you, how would you describe it as being?
Ooh. Yeah, no, I understand what you're asking. I think I resonate really strongly with it not being a solution, and I'm sort of proud of that, ironically. It is not a self-help book. I think I mean, I'm struggling not to just fall on things that sound like platitudes. It's an experience, it's a journey. But it is, I hope, um, a very, it takes something that I think a lot of us take for granted, the ability to see ourselves whenever we want, and also just vision generally. It takes those things very seriously and is like, hey, pause, let's think about the implications all these things have. And so yeah, it's definitely not a solution, but I think what it does do is say, let's be thoughtful about these things, because if we're thoughtful about what we expose ourselves to in terms of what we're looking at, if we're thoughtful about, maybe I don't need to see myself all that often, as often as is available to me, or if we're thoughtful about those things, maybe that can lead us to, adopting new rituals or new traditions that bring us the kind of meaning we want to have in our lives, rather than the kind that is just easily culturally available, without question.
I love that. I love the idea of a new ritual. I think we could use more of those. Well, so in my final question, and Zoom is telling me I have exactly 9 minutes left to ask you this,
Amazing.
is who or what is inspiring you right now?
Oh, wow. I think, my brain goes in like a million different directions when you ask that question. I One of the first ones is Stacey Abrams,
Yes,
in
absolutely.
Georgia.
Yeah.
And just like, I think people in general who are working really hard to bring people together in a moment where we've all been told rightly, by healthcare professionals for the past couple of years to not be together, to explicitly like be very separate and alone and safe that way. But I think now, it's, yeah, we just have to think of new ways to be together, and to live together and thrive together. And I think I'm just really impressed by her grassroots organization efforts, her voter registration efforts, her ability to get people to believe in a process that's very broken and in sort of the future of what that could look like, not just, like getting people to participate in a system that's broken so that we can fix it, is really exciting to me. So she comes to mind initially. But I also think in terms of writers, especially, I'm thinking a lot about people who are pushing the boundaries of genre and of form. And obviously this book couldn't have been written without the examples of people like Paisley Rekdal, whose prose poem Nightingale a Gloss really inspired me, and that's the titular poem of her book Nightingale. Also obviously Maggie Nelson, blew my mind when I was a first year MFA, and everyone was like, you have to read this book. The Argonauts also equally incredible. Mary Rufla, and Anne Carson also, and I think Sarah Vapp also, Wintering, was a really interesting book. There's just, I think it's no coincidence that a lot of the people who are doing, not everyone, but a lot of the people who are doing some of the most interesting genre bendy work are people who've been pushed there, who've been pushed out of traditional forms because their experiences don't fit into those molds. And so they're interested in invention, and in creating very new things, and new experiences. And I really hope that we are sitting at sort of the dawn of the golden age of the lyric essay and of some of these other forms that are emerging, because they're super exciting.
Yes, here's to the dawning of the golden age of the lyric essay. I'm
Yeah.
excited for it. Amazing.